COVID. There's a word, if I was standing here 3 years ago, many of us, indeed all of us, may not have heard of, but boy have we heard of it now. And of course it's had some really systemic effects on society, some negative systemic effects on society, both at a macro and micro level. But actually there's also been some benefits, and that one of the main benefits, which I'm going to cover today, or touch on, is our relationship with nature. And it's made us appreciate nature in much more detail. And it's had some interesting impacts. So for example, in London last year, the population of the city decreased for the first time in 30 years by 700,000 people as they exited to go and live in the countryside. Now that is rebalancing somewhat as we get back to some level of normality. And even at a micro level, our research is showing some interesting changes as well. So if you happen to own or want to buy a balcony apartment, or an apartment with a balcony, the chances are you're going to pay a little bit more of a premium now for it because of the outside space. So, negative impact of COVID, but every action has a reaction, and there's certainly some positives in terms of our appreciation of nature. And if you consider about climate change and the need for us to be more sympathetic and empathetic to the natural world, maybe, just maybe, that's one of the positive benefits to come out of the last 2 or so years. As a placemaking and place branding consultancy, we invest a lot of time in thought leadership and our own research. And indeed, that's what I want to talk to you about today. Back in the summer of 2019, before COVID, having worked with developers, architects, landscapers, an idea crossed my mind. I was really intrigued by particularly the architects and landscapers, and indeed some developers, who invested a disproportionate amount of their space in providing for natural amenities and natural environment. I was quite intrigued by this subject, so I approached my old university in Scotland, the University of Dundee, and embarked on a project which has now manifested itself in a report and a book, The Nature of Communities, and I'm going to share with you today 6 highlights from what we found. Now, with the university, we examined 159 academic papers and published reports and distilled that into a 60-page report. I could, quite frankly, have shared 1,006 insights with you, but I'm just going to pick on 6 in particular. And in terms of the subject area of the Nature of Communities book, there were a number. So well-being, maybe not surprisingly, psychology, human geography, landscape and urban planning, but also interestingly, given this was back at the back end of 2019, even epidemiology. And then of course COVID hit February, March of 2020, and little did we know that the subject that we were looking at, the nature of communities, was going to come even more to the fore. And when we sat down with the university, we asked a number of essential questions that we wanted them to help answer on our behalf and with them. The first one was, what actually makes a community? And there are lots of academic definitions. I'm going to share an insight into that shortly. But also then building on that, what is our relationship with nature? What benefits does it have at various stages in our lives? And indeed, if we have a greater appreciation of nature through the natural and built environment in which we live, does that give us a greater appreciation and awareness of things like climate change and all of this working together? So the first question, or the first insight I should say, is surely green is good. A natural environment has to be fantastic, so bring it on, let's have more of it. And certainly some research supports that. So for example, natural parks that dedicate at least 50% of the land to natural habitat preservation have found to deliver for developers a large proximity premium. Put simply, if you've got green space around, you can charge more for your houses, your apartments, the development. Why is that? Well, there's a well-known fact about human behavior, which is attention restoration. Attention restoration is linked to the prefrontal cortex in our brains, which controls our cognitive flexibility and dopamine production. And dopamine gives us a feel-good factor. So, if you're feeling a bit stressed at work, take a nice stroll in a green park at lunchtime or by a river. And of course, there are blue and green infrastructure strategies that developers can employ. But attention restoration is so fundamental to us as human beings in terms of our development based on survival. However, and this is something that we're seeing increasingly through our research in cities, somewhere like London, is that it is slowly but surely becoming a social justice issue. Now, if you think about some developments that may have podium gardens for the residents who live there, or private parks that you can have access to only if you're a resident, it's a bit like the old squares of London centuries ago, that if you lived around it, you'd have a special key that would unlock the gate and you can go and spend some time there. But the more new developments that are coming on board, and the more of those that sometimes restrict the access just to residents, increasingly we're hearing and seeing this issue around social injustice. And indeed, that is translating into what's called green gentrification. We've heard of gentrification in terms of buildings when, say, a middle class comes into a previously deprived area, does up the houses, gentrifies the built infrastructure. But also we're seeing through our own research an increasing theme around green gentrification. And the developers with more foresight actually realize that and ensure that there's good accessibility to that green area to the wider community, not just for the residents. So green is good generally, but it has to be treated with a little bit of caution. But surely we should just put loads of green in there. But the second insight I want to share is around having just green enough. It's a bit like Goldilocks, not too little green, not too much green, just the right amount. And as Curran and Hamilton, the academic, said in 2012, a strategy that makes room for continued industrial use and blue-collar work where cleanup does not automatically or exclusively lead to the parks, cafes, and a riverwalk model of a green city. So it's got to be a good mix. Now, the next photo, it's not a holiday snap. Just before COVID struck, and I promise you I wasn't the one responsible for bringing it back from China, I had the opportunity to visit Shanghai. And we spent some time with developers there looking at how they sell to investors out in that market, which was fascinating in itself. But we also had the opportunity to visit the Heatherwick Studio building, Thousand Trees. And I'm using this as more of a proxy and a symbol for this idea that a developer here, as you can see, has integrated the green space into the built environment. And I think there's a theme for any architect who's in the room called Parasitic Architecture, where a building takes on other forms, in this case, trees. And I believe this is a mix of commercial and residential, and that's really the point. Just green enough. You know, you want to provide good residential space, good natural environment, but also we need good working environment, good leisure, good retail. So it's that total mix. And I'm sure everybody in the room knows about NEOM. Really, really intriguing, very ambitious development, and we will certainly be keeping a very close eye on it in terms of this concept of just green enough. Of course, you know, given the environment, the climate in which it's being built, this will be fascinating at a number of levels. The third insight I want to share of the 6 is what we call mind the gap, and a gap for the mind. Now, some really interesting research that shows, and this was done by a university, that shows the physical health outcomes and benefits that we derive from living in a certain place and its proximity to a green space comes when that green space is about 1 kilometre from our home. That's the physical benefit. But interestingly, the mental benefit, through the research that they've done, they've shown really comes when that green space is 3 kilometres or more from the place of residence, which in a way, common sense can unravel this a bit or unpick it and go, that makes sense. Because if you have to make more of an effort to travel that little bit further to a green space, just that mental gap, if you like, the break from your home to that space creates a bit of air in your head, if you like. Now that has implications, particularly for urban planners. And I'll say this from the perspective of London, where prior to COVID, a lot of developers were quite focused on, right, our development is 100 metres from a local tube station. So, and that's great because that'll get you into London on your commute. Of course, all bets are off now. That dynamic has changed to a large degree. So now what we're encouraging urban planners to do is think about not just that commuting network, that connectivity to your workplace, but the connectivity to green spaces maybe 3 kilometres or more away from the development because of that mental benefit that it provides. Another concept that I think was referenced yesterday as well, which has come to the fore in the last few years, is that of the 15-minute city. Now, I believe this concept, I think, was first highlighted by a French planner or architect. I might be wrong. And this was a number of years ago. And of course, again, COVID has come in, and can't speak on behalf of other markets, but certainly we're seeing in the UK, as people reconnect with their local neighbourhoods because they're spending more time there in the day, they're inquisitive and indeed need the amenities, the retail that maybe they were getting at their place of work. So things like a nice park, a favourite bar, the dentist, work, the best bakery that it has, a favourite cafe, or even your friend's house is important. So connectivity going down, other things coming more to the fore in the concept of the 15-minute city. The fourth insight I want to share is around trees versus bushes. What does this mean? Well, it's kind of, there's that question, is green good? Yes, it is. How much green should be in a development? A certain amount, not too much. You need commercial and retail space and entertainment and leisure. But then beyond that, what type of green do we put into developments? And research has shown that there is a difference between the impact that trees have versus foliage like bushes. Now, Coley back in 1999 did some research, and it showed that in Chicago, in poor inner city areas, people were more likely to gather in communal spaces where there were large trees. A number of reasons for that. Connectivity to nature, maybe something as very simple as protection from the rain, but also maybe just leaning up against the tree and having a picnic. But this research said, yeah, trees are definitely beneficial in that sense, particularly in an area that may be more deprived. And therefore, urban planners thinking about the impact. Little known fact that I discovered I was told by a London taxi driver the other day, in the city of London, that's not London overall, but the city which is the Square Mile district, the historical part, apparently there's a tree, it's the only city in the world that has a tree in every lane, road or street there. Don't know if that's true, it might have been a taxi driver just trying to impress me and get an extra large tip, but there we go. However, there's a caution that goes along with this. Keogh and Sullivan in 2001 did some research which suggested that the presence of dense vegetation has been associated with an increased fear of crime. Not an increased level of crime, but an increased fear of crime, which again makes perfect sense. If you think about a park near you that you might live, and if there's dense bushes, as a man or woman maybe walking through there at night, are you going to walk close to those dense bushes, maybe in fear that somebody's going to jump out and attack you? So urban planners have to think about that. Conversely, we know that through our research, older people find it more intimidating to be in large open park spaces. So the landscaper has to give consideration to different life stages, different needs, and different emotional drivers. Really interesting concept you might have come across before, which is this idea of desire paths. Michigan State University, I think, was the first place where they experimented with this, where they were building a new campus area and they had a large internal square. And rather, as some developers do, go, right, we need to put in a path here to take you from X building to Y building, they just said, let's leave it open. Let's see where humans naturally walk on the desire path. So you can see here illustrations of how that might work. And I think this is interesting. We see it in developers maybe dropping their shoulders a little bit and not being so worried about putting very prescribed infrastructure into a place, but enabling people just to naturally absorb themselves in it and develop things like desire paths. The fifth one, and it's something that, no pun intended, we don't hear so much about, and that's the sound on a development. Now, we know from working with developers, a lot of consideration is given to the sound of machinery and equipment when they're building, but what about the overall sound ambience within a development? And our research and all the work that we do with developers suggests that actually there's an opportunity here. And we know from the academic studies that we've done, so Davies back in 2013 showed that natural sounds are associated with tranquility, which is why if you go to an airport lounge, you might get the tinkling of water or bird song just to relax you before you're about to sit in a metal tube for 6 hours. Equally, we know from our own research, the sound of children, for example, playing in a primary school is really motivating for the older generations, the downsizers. Now, there is a caveat to that. We also know from the same research that kids at secondary schools are not quite so endearing to the older generations because they, maybe rightly or wrongly, associate it with poor behavior and rowdiness rather than that somewhat nostalgic sound of kids playing in a playground and maybe a throwback to them, or maybe it reminds them of their own grandchildren. And then we've got some very practical issues. Again, from our own research, and we do a lot of primary research with residents in different developments, the increase in quality of technology of sound equipment in televisions. You think sound bars and HD TVs. Living in an apartment, we know it's becoming of increasing concern to people moving in. They're asking now about the quality of the build of the walls. And indeed, one developer that we're working with in their sales and marketing suite has done a cutaway of a wall to demonstrate how they've soundproofed that wall in greater detail than maybe a competitor might have done. So there's some very practical issues. But all of this led us to ask the question, maybe if you're a developer in the room or an architect, what about auditory planning at all stages of the development, from the build through to actually living there when it's established? And we're beginning to work with a specialist company who manage sound in the built environment, and that we're very much looking forward to the outcome of that. And the last insight I want to share with you goes back to that first essential question. What is a community? What makes a community? Now, the academic definition is around this idea that a community is formed when it's people who have a shared set of values. Doesn't mean to say they're all identical, and indeed the best communities have a really good mix of generations, ages, ethnicities, countries, etc. But they all tend to exhibit, and again we know this from the primary research that we've done, they all tend to exhibit a shared set of values, whatever those values may be. It is interesting as a side. Now, this might be a little bit small on the screen. Each of these 4 blocks are taken from the corporate websites of 4 UK developers. I've kept them anonymous to protect their identities. What is interesting, if you look at each of these, you'll see variations on a theme, which is we, the developer, create communities. So if I take the top left-hand one, a customer-focused residential developer building and delivering homes and communities. So building and delivering homes and communities. The second one, we work with local people. We're passionate about building the right homes for our customers. Sorry, we work with local people to create communities. Bottom right-hand one, our vision, creating exceptional homes and sustainable communities, creating communities. Now, I was doing a research group a couple of years ago on a major regeneration program in London, and it was appropriate to ask the group, what actually do you think makes a community? And within an instant, one of the participants in the focus group looked at me and said 6 to 7 years. And of course, we know what he meant by that, which is it takes time for a community to organically grow and settle, get to know each other. Maybe after 3 years, some people move out and you get a new wave in, and that new wave of people have seen the community build and they feel as though, yeah, this is a community for me. So our contention is that it's with the greatest of respect to developers, they put the infrastructure in, they build the infrastructure to enable the people, the residents, the workers there, to create the community. And it's a subtle but important distinction, we believe. Academic research also shows that there are 7 components, 7 successful aspects to building a community. They are spirit, does it have that good vibe? Does it provide people with emotional safety? Are there very clear boundaries? And we're not just talking about physical boundaries, we're talking about emotional boundaries as well. Of course, is there a sense of belonging in that community? Do people trust each other? And can they trade with each other? And we're not just talking about trade in terms of goods, but trade of ideas as well. But the last one, symbols, is something I just want to dwell on. I had the pleasure of visiting a couple of days ago the Dubai Design District, D3, and it's interesting looking at some of the symbols, the architecture, the public art installations are there. And indeed, we were involved. We do a lot of work with a company called Berkeley Homes in the UK, and they've got amongst many successful developments, one in the City of London that's called Goodman's Fields near Liverpool Street. And when this development was established a number of years ago, a sculptor was commissioned to produce 5 horses that you can see here. We can see 3 of them. Now, these are very nice, they look good, they're very interesting, they're dynamic, they interact with the water fountains there, and if you go there in the summer, you can see kids from the local community who don't live at Goodman's Fields coming to play there. So it's great, going back to that opening out and the green gentrification. This is very much open. The other interesting aspect is the horses represent a story about the development itself. Now, this particular site, 150 years ago, was the site of horse stables. So what it's doing, at one level, it's just going, here's a nice sculpture to enjoy, but for those who want to dig a little bit deeper, there's substance in it. It's bringing part of the local archaeology, the local story to life. My closing slide, I'm going to give over to Dr. Beverly Searle, who was one of the co-authors of the book with us, and she twisted slightly JFK's famous phrase about don't think about what America can do for you, think about what you can do for America. And she said, adopting a well-known phrase, we can think about contact with nature as what can nature do for me, whereas nature connectedness is what can I do for nature. Thank you very much. Any hard questions from the audience? Go on, I knew you were going to ask.
So it was a very interesting talk. I think you addressed a lot of issues. But what about building communities that are inherently reusing things and recycling things? Is that part of what your vision is?
I'll start to answer it in this way. What we, as a company, we see a lot with the developers that we're working with, and you think of some of the big cities in the UK, like London, Birmingham, Manchester, which I know you've spent some time in, which have historical buildings, particularly back to the industrial age, the Industrial Revolution. And we see how those are being repurposed at the moment. So we're working, for example, on a development near Slough in West London, near Heathrow Airport, that's an old Horlicks factory, the malt drink that I think is quite popular in India, for example. And we know from the primary research we've done there, people really find it appealing to be living in a place that has a long history about it. So that's repurposing the built environment, and we see that's coming more to the fore. And I suppose the other part of the answer to that I'd offer up is that going back to this theme of parasitic architecture and how, looking at the Heatherwick studio building, how even a new building can be brought with a different perspective by bringing nature really integrated into it. And I think that's the important point for developers. And again, with the best developers we work with, we see them approaching a parcel of land at an integrated level, rather than going, right, here's the building, and now let's put a few trees and bushes around the place. It's like, let's look at the overall place, let's take on board some of the themes that I've shared with you today, and let's really understand. I mean, we had a very interesting workshop with a developer last week that we were facilitating, where this development is going to be finished in 2050. And we brought into that session some really interesting trends around, for example, hydroponic farms. And if you're a developer, we know urban farms is one of many, many trends in terms of the way the world is going. Well, why wouldn't you now build into that development a hydroponic farm, for example? I hope that goes some way to answer your question.
Thank you.
Yeah. In the communities, I'm here.
Oh, sorry.
Right in front of you. So what is the open space you leave for the greenery, percentage-wise? Suppose if you are 1,000 square meter, 10,000 square meter of community you are building.
Like the previous speaker, I'm getting a lot of free. So your question is?
In the communities.
And I'll repeat the question in a second.
In the communities, what is the open space you leave for the greenery, percentage-wise?
So if I've understood the question correctly, it's what space do you leave open? We work with a couple of developers where they commit to 50% of the space of a large, it could be 200 or 300 acre development, 50% of the space being dedicated to some form of open space. And by the way, that 50% is not necessarily manufactured or landscaped. Got a developer who's working very closely, for example, with the London Wildlife Trust. And they are now introducing much more, let's call it wilding. So instead of nice manicured rose bushes, it's letting nature take its own course a little bit more naturally. And for example, a river might exist there. So rather than just have the river and then the landscaped area, then the built environment, is make that river more permeable with the rest of the land. So simple answer to your question is, the best developers we see are dedicating 50% of their space to open at some description, and within that, it's letting nature take more of a natural course.
In the cities like London, how much space is left for the greenery?
Oh, in London as a city? Oh, there's a good question. What I do know is the major parks, the royal parks like Hyde Park, St James Park, Green Park, they are protected, and they're known as the lungs of London, because hopefully the pollution is decreasing, but at a time, maybe 20, 30 years ago, those parks were essential for... now, that has historical aspects. If you go to Green Park, anybody who's in London, go to Green Park next to Buckingham Palace, you'll see there are mounds of... It just looks like mounds. Those were apparently created by the burial grounds from the plague. So there's a lot of history in the natural world that is there. Thank you very much.